This episode of Quid Pros Quo is brought to you by Barter Toast.
One of the things that I've noticed as I've interacted with authors is that we come from all walks of life. For example, I'm an astrophysicist, and I've met authors who have had careers in fields as different as software development to city planning. Every author has a unique set of talents above and beyond those related to writing, and when you're independently publishing, it's important to leverage those skills. Unfortunately, there are so many parts to publishing that you will inevitably find that you don't have the talent or the skill set you need for that piece. For example, I am awful at drawing, and I'm not great at graphic design either, so I can't make character or cover art on my own. That's where Barter Toast comes in. Barter Toast is a place where you can swap your skills for help with things that you can't do on your own. Whether it's website design, audio editing, or marketing help you need, you can find it on Barter Toast. Once you find someone with the skills you need, you offer one of your skills to them in return. You might swap beta reading feedback for a character portrait, typesetting for website help, or a constructed language for a publicity boost. If you're ready to leverage your skills to take the next step in indie publishing, head to www.bartertoast.com to sign up and start bartering. That's www.bartertoast.com. I'll see you there.
Welcome to Quid Pros Quo, where creativity meets academia. Here, we're all about leveraging our love of academia to improve both your creative writing practice and ours. Whether you're honing your craft or just beginning your writing journey, we're here to share scholarly insights, inspiration, and advice that benefits us all. Let's get started. Hi, and welcome to Quid Pros Quo. I'm Rin.
And I'm Zach.
And today we are starting our course on fairy tales. I'm super excited for this course because I love fairy tales. I don't know if you could tell from my body of work, but I love fairy tales. So, fairy tales are some of the oldest stories we have. They started as oral tales and were eventually written down by scholars such as Charles Perrault, Hans Christian Andersen, and the Brothers Grimm. We're all familiar with versions of these fairy tales, but a key thing to think about during the course of the story is why the fairy tale is the way it is. This is often dependent on who's telling the story and their motive. For example, the Grimm brothers were doing it out of love of their culture and to preserve the old German ideals. Unfortunately, this meant the patriarchal ideals of late 1700s, early 1800s in Europe. But over the years, we've gotten more and more tellings of different fairy tales from all over the world. They've undergone countless revisions, some more popular than others. For example, the name Walt Disney ring a bell?
Yeah, Disney is definitely one of those the go-tos when we think about versions of fairy tales, since so many of Western fairy tales have been retold through either by Walt Disney or through the Walt Disney Corporation. And most people these days are probably more familiar with the Disney versions than any other version of these fairy tales. Though a lot of people have an inkling that the Grimm's version is out there and that it's vaguely darker, but not quite sure how. Cinderella is a good example. The Brothers Grimm version, which is the basis for the Broadway musical Into the Woods, ends with the sisters cutting off their toes and ankles to try and make them fit into the slipper, which was an embroidered silk and silver slipper, not made out of glass, which is the version that we're referencing inside of the show notes. This is in contrast to the Disney version, which has the glass slipper. There's no blood. But even when you're looking at the Disney version, it's undergone revisions when you compare the original animated Cinderella to the live action remake in 2015, starring Lily James. For one of the most obvious has to do with the color of Cinderella's dress, moving from silver to blue, partially as a reflection of some of the promotional material that has been used around Cinderella. And we could go on like a whole other topic about the relationship in between the Disney remakes of classical fairy tales and the marketing and the promotional materials. But there are lots of great essays about that out on TikTok. So if you're interested in it, please go find those. We'd love to chat with you about them.
Yeah, absolutely. So what do you do when you have like so many fairy tales? How do you even like begin to categorize them, to classify them? And I wouldn't know how to approach it, but some scholars who are way smarter than me have taken it upon themselves to create an index of fairy tales of folklore, because there's so many and they stand such huge cultural divides. This index is called the Arne Thompson Uther Index, and I can spell that for you because it's weird. AARNE hyphen OMPSON hyphen UTHER, or simplified the ATU. From the Harvard ATU website, we read the ATU index allows researchers to identify the underlying structure of a tale and to cross reference it with other tales from around the world to share the same elements or themes. Each tale type entry describes which themes and motifs comprises a specific tale type. Motifs each have an identifying number, which can be cross-referenced with Thompson's motif index of folk literature. In this way, researchers can identify similar story types and even vastly different tales which share motifs. So this is like, first of all, super cool that someone has thought to do this, and there are, thousands of numbers. We'll go over the tale types in a bit, because there's 7 tale types across those thousands of numbers.
So the 7 tale types in the ATU index are animal tales, tales of magic, religious tales, realistic tales, tales of the stupid ogre or giant or devil, anecdotes and jokes, and then formula tales. And it's kind of like a Dewey Decimal System for fairy tales and their motifs. So every tale type has a number somewhere in between 1 and 2,399. And by referencing that number, it tells you something about the structure of the fairy tale. And like was mentioned before, you can also use it to deconstruct the motifs inside of the tale and compare it to other tales that are from completely different cultural contexts and historical contexts, in order to, do that comparative literature stuff that we so love.
Yeah, for sure. So, with that history in mind, what makes a fairy tale? Because the title of this episode is Fairy Tales as a genre. So let's talk about what makes a fairy tale into a fairy tale.
Yeah. Fairy tales are a genre of folklore, just like myths and legends. Folklore, like the name suggests, is the lore of the folk or the stories and beliefs of a particular group of people. And one of the things that distinguishes fairy tales from other genres of folklore is that the teller of the fairy tale and the listener of the fairy tale know that they are listening to a story and that the story is not a record of true, meaning historical events. One of the other things that makes fairy tales is that they're decentralized. They are not part of a broader formal institution like a church or a state that propagates the tale as a way of teaching culture. These stories are usually told from parents to children or from other adult figures inside of children's lives. And so there isn't that same formal structure behind the telling of these fairy tales like you would see for certain myths or legends.
For sure. I think it's also interesting to think about like the crossover between like fairy tales and maybe myths or legends. Because I was recently researching the Pied Piper as like a potential retelling. I was at a writing retreat and someone was like, "Oh, you should." They learned how to play flute, and they were like, "You should write a book about a kid who wants to be a flute." I was like, "I don't know if I could like do that. That feels very like contemporary middle grade, and I don't write that." Yeah. And then we like landed on the idea of doing like the Pied Piper's Apprentice, and I was like, "That I could retell." But technically, the Pied Piper is a legend, but I think a lot of people think of it more as a fairy tale.
Right.
So there is some wiggle room between them. But even though there is wiggle room, there is that delineation. Like, even if people view the legend as a fairy tale, it's still a legend. Right. But I'm sure there are other examples that are more blurred lines than the Pied Piper.
Right. And I mean, that's true of genres in general, right? Where you have clear delineations between different genres, but then you can always find an example that like straddles the line. So you have Star Wars, which some people classify as sci-fi because it takes place in a sci-fi setting, even though the structure and the themes and everything are all mythological fantasy. So you have that kind of straddling happening there.
It's like the rules are not actually rules, they're just good suggestions. It's the opposite of Bill Nye's gravity. It's not a good idea. It's the law.
Right, right.
But it's the opposite of that. um, so another characteristic of fairy tales is they begin with like these stock phrases, and in English, these stock phrases are to begin once upon a time and to end happily ever after. And you see that in like of the old classic Disney princess movies. You see like the book opening and the narrator goes, "Once upon a time," and
Yeah.
of course it ends with the book closing and happily ever after. But in other languages, there are different stock phrases, and you can find them all on Wikipedia. But here are some of our favorites.
Yeah, so some of the Slovak tales begin with Beyond Seven Mountains and Seven Valleys, or Where the Water Was Being Strewn and the Stand Poured.
Korea often starts with back when tigers used to smoke tobacco, which I think is a fun image.
I know, right? That's so delightful. Some of them have more nursery rhyme sort of uh, formulations. For example, the one of the classic stock endings for classical Arabic tales is "Tuta tuta, the story is over," which I don't know. That just makes me so happy.
It's so whimsical.
Yes.
Yeah, love that. Then the Bengali ending is my story ends and the spinach is eaten by the goat, which is like funny and also whimsical.
Yeah.
And I've used the word whimsical twice in like the last 2 minutes. I feel like we should talk about fairy tales and whimsy for a second, even though it's not in the notes.
Yeah.
I
Let's do
feel
it.
like fairy tales have evolved to be more whimsical over
Mhm.
time, and I think that's probably direct influence of the Disney retellings
Right.
because like especially the Brothers Grimm versions of the tales are pretty dark, and they have a bunch of like not as popular, but like in our day and age, not popular fairy tales that are just like dark and scary. I once like was in a situationship with a guy who was like, I love this one particular Grimm fairy tale, and it's a kid who gets like stuck in a hole for being bad. Like, and it's the moral of the story is obviously obey your parents, which we'll talk about in a second. But
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
insane that was his favorite. He was a walking red flag.
Yeah. Well, it's
um,
interesting that you bring up whimsy because my wife and I have been watching more of the Studio Ghibli films as like a way to like relax and rewind. And I was reading a little bit about Spirited Away and about how Spirited Away is one of Miyazaki's fairy tales was the phraseology that was used inside of the promotional material. And when you think about some of those sorts of stories, those are definitely more whimsical, where, you have a bathhouse with the spirits and they're all fun shapes and sizes and different colors. And it's, it's magical and it's wonderful. Even when there are scary elements, you still have that underlying whimsy to them. Um, that's not necessarily the case in fairy tale retellings, but that's getting too far ahead with another episode topic that we'll talk about.
right. But yeah, I think the whimsy in like modern fairy tales and fairy tale retellings and fairy tale reiterations is like maybe it speaks to like the zeitgeist of the culture. Like we're just tired of like sad things. Like if you think of like Snow White, it came out in what the 1930s, and the
Yes.
remake came out like this week or something like that. But like right after World War I and in the midst of World War II, people were like so tired of things being dark and scary that maybe they like turned to like these classical stories to lighten their moods and to have some form of escapism.
Mm-hmm.
So that's speculation. That's not actual reasoning, but it feels like solid speculation.
We love it.
Another characteristic of fairy tales is they take place in a time and place other than what the audience is used to. A faraway land in a faraway time.
Many of the stock openings that we just talked about do this. Like both the Slovak and Korean openings frame the story within a time defined by something completely the opposite of lived reality. Like there is nowhere on earth that you can go and see a tiger smoking tobacco. P.T. Barnum
Right.
has gone the way of the dodo, so we're not going to see it. Um, but with the phrase about water being strewn and sand poured is an inversion of what you normally do with each of those things. Normally, you
True.
strew, yeah, you strew sand and pour water, but it's inverted inside of that opening, which gets you into the mind space and helps you to know that this story is taking place in that time outside of time, that place that's far away.
Since you brought up Star Wars earlier, I feel obligated to mention A Galaxy Long Ago, or what's I can't
A
remember
long
the
time
opening.
ago in a galaxy far, far
Yes,
away.
that one. That also sets it in a time and place other than what we're used to. So I think we could argue Star Wars is also a fairy tale.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that because in the Ahsoka television show, they actually use that phrase as an opening to an in-world fairy tale. There's a scene where one of
Oh,
the characters asks one of the other characters to tell her a story, and the other character responds with "a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away," and
oh
that's
my
their
god.
stock phrase for a fairy tale.
That's so cool. I haven't seen the entire Ahsoka show, so that's so cool that my random thought played into the actual TV series.
Yeah, it was
It's
really cool.
canon. Yeah, that's awesome. Um, so finally, not finally, continuing on, Francisco Vaz de Silva, who we will put his fairy tale symbolism paper in the show notes. He argues that the lack of distinction between animals and beasts in fairy tales points to a savage fancy, which is first the characteristic here is there's lots of animals and beasts in fairy tales, and they know how to talk and do other things, and they're clever. And you think of
Mhm.
like Aesop's fables, and they're just all talking animals. If I remember correctly, I've not read this paper since I prepped the notes more than a month ago. Um,
Love it.
I was so ahead prepping these notes, folks. Um, but he talks about the savage fancy where he's like, maybe in another land there is like people or animals who can talk. And it's just like this idea of like savagery and the romanticization of the savage. Like,
Mhm.
I would argue Tarzan, well, not technically a fairy tale, is definitely like an example of the savage fancy.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah.
There are common symbols in fairy tales, and there's discourse on which to be taken literally. We won't get into that discourse because it's real deep, but in De Silva's paper as well as the ATU index. But
Yeah, it's the sort
some
of
of
thing
these
that you like.
comments,
I was just going to say,
pardon?
this is the sort of thing that you like write a dissertation on.
Right, exactly. Um, but some of these like common elements you may think of are like again talking animals, specific like flower imagery.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm trying to pull stuff like out of thin air and it's not working for me. But like, there's tons. Go look at the ATU index, and
Yeah.
you know, there's like religious symbolism and magical symbolism, and if you look at like Disney motifs, you're looking at like how evil is always lime green.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
There's tons of stuff. Like Zach said, you could write a dissertation on this. If you do send it to us, please, we would love to like feature it on the show.
Yeah, for sure.
I think this is actually the final like characteristic of the genre that we picked out. But there has to be a moral of some sort. Because without a moral, a fairy tale has no purpose. So this is like very much like, you know, elementary school literature analysis where they're like, okay, what's the moral of the story? Which, fun fact, one time I did a reading of my book, All Hail the Queen of Hearts, at a like an elementary school, I think it was. And they asked me what the moral of All Hail the Queen of Hearts was, and I had to pull it out of thin air because I never thought about that, like consciously. It was, and these kids were like, "What's the moral of the story?" And I was like, "Well, I think it's like you should be like nice to other people because if you aren't nice, then like bad things happen to you," which is pretty accurate for All Hail the Queen of Hearts.
Yeah. Yeah.
But for example, many grim tales are to teach children to honor their parents. If you don't honor their parents, bad things will happen to you. That's a common thing throughout the tales. Again, it reflects their like their zeitgeist. Their I've used the
Yeah.
word zeitgeist a few times. We should also define that if you aren't familiar with the term. Zeitgeist is like the cultural the spirit of the culture, the spirit of the people.
It
Literally
literally
translated, it is a German word.
Yeah, it literally translates to the spirit of the time.
Yeah. So, which you know a little bit of German, I think, so that's perfect. I cannot remember exactly what it translates to. I got the Geist part, but I cannot remember what Zeit stood for.
Yeah.
But like it reflects a common belief in Europe prior to the proliferation of the novel. The children were inherently evil and had to be civilized to act like adults. This goes back to the weird guy I dated who thought the best fairy tale was the kid who gets stuck in a hole because he disobeys his parents. Evil.
The kid, obviously, right? Because he needed to learn his lesson from sitting in the hole for a super long time.
Right. I think he might die in the hole though. Like it was dark. Which is like
Wow.
again to be expected of Grimm fairy tales. I don't remember which fairy tale it was now. I'd have to like read the collection and try and find it. Or do a very specific Google search. But like anyways, that guy was weird. As we like get to like the end of this episode, some people argue that fairy tales must be like of a certain age, meaning like having a certain be representative of a certain zeitgeist or carry a certain message. For example, a patriarchal message to truly classify as a fairy tale. And they often discount queer or feminist takes on the tales. We at Quid Pros Quo will not be adhering to this strict take because we are not down with the patriarchy. And we'll be delving and focusing into more feminist and queer takes as well as the more classical ones.
It's going to be
So,
a smorgasbord of takes.
yes, we are going to try and present a balanced opinion, but we're not only doing the patriarchal stuff because that would not be balanced. But
Right.
we're also not only going to do the queer stuff because that ignores the history of the genre. And it's important to us that we recognize the history of the genre as well as where it's going.
So, what can you expect for the rest of the course? We're going to be doing an episode on creating new fairy tales. We're also going to do another episode about retelling fairy tales and how to adapt a fairy tale. And then for our case studies for this series, our traditionally published case study is going to be The Lunar Chronicles by Marissa Meyer. And then for the independently published book, we're going to do something a little bit different, and we're going to host a roundtable discussion with some authors who have written fairy tale retellings, specifically that are selling their books through the Salient bookstore. We'll include a link inside of the show notes if you want to go and check it out. The Salient bookstore is super cool because it only stocks independently published authors. So if you are looking to expand your reading horizons outside of the Zon to go find independent authors, Salient Books is a great place to go.
For sure. Your homework for this episode is to let us know in your comments your favorite fairy tale and which iteration of that fairy tale. So I want to know if your favorite fairy tale is also the kid who gets stuck in a hole because he disobeys his parents, or if it's Cinderella, but like the ancient Egyptian version. Like, let us know in the comments your favorite fairy tale and where that iteration comes from that makes it your favorite.
Thank you so much for joining us. This has been Quid Pros Quo. We'll see you next week. Quid Pros Quo is hosted by DC Winters and CK Jensen. If you like this episode, please subscribe and leave us a rating on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to contact us, you can email us at quidprosquo@gmail.com. Thank you for joining us today.